What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 12 Thanksgiving games. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone!
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for all 3 games on Thanksgiving. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, happy Thanksgiving. Let's go over the 3 games on Thanksgiving. We have the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions. We have the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Giants. And we have the New England Patriots playing the Minnesota Vikings. So let's take a look at the quarterback position. So the stud on the slate is Josh Allen. He's questionable, but I think he's going to play, and he's got a good matchup here. Actually, he has the best possible matchup on paper. Josh Allen from the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Josh Allen has averaged 27.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 7.1 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 48% owned, projected at 29.5 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. And Josh Allen is $8,000 DraftKings salary, $1,500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 54.5 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills favored by 9.5. So Josh Allen has scored 13, 26, and 27 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 3, 6, and 9 rush attempts in those games. So I like Josh Allen here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, now coming way down in salary here, the rest of the quarterbacks, they are all much cheaper than Josh Allen. And there's 2 guys that I think have 20 plus fantasy point upside. First guy is Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Giants, who have a middle of the pack defense overall. And although they've been pretty good versus opposing quarterbacks, Dak Prescott has averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.4 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 15% owned, projected at 19 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving, and he's $6,200 DraftKings salary, $1,800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 9.5. Now, Dak Prescott, he's been on fire, scoring 21, 21, and 26 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 3, 4, and 5 rush attempts in those games. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the New York Giants. Okay, now if you want to save some more salary and go with a low-owned quarterback here, I like Daniel Jones from the New York Giants playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a good defense overall. They've been good versus opposing quarterbacks, but Daniel Jones has averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game on the season. And I like this pick because he's getting an average of 7.6 rush attempts per game. And he's only going to be about 8% owned. Now, only projected at 16.2 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. That's because it's not a great matchup, but I do think he could score 18 fantasy points or more, at least hit his season average here. And I think he has clear 20 plus fantasy point upside with those rush attempts, with that rushing upside. And his price tag is only at $5,500 DraftKings salary, $2,000 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Giants trailing by 9.5. So I do think the Giants are going to be trailing in this game. I think they're going to be forced to pass the ball, so Daniel Jones could get plenty of pass attempts in this one. And Daniel Jones has scored 30, 18, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 5, and 6 rush attempts. So we see he's got that 25 to 30 fantasy point upside. So I like Daniel Jones here versus the Dallas Cowboys.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So the studs on the slate: Saquon Barkley, Dalvin Cook. Now, neither of these guys had good games last week. Saquon Barkley only scored 6 fantasy points off of 15 rush attempts and 5 pass targets. Dalvin Cook only scored 7 fantasy points off of 11 rush attempts and 1 pass target. But these guys are the best running backs on the slate. Now, neither of these guys have good matchups either. The Dallas Cowboys are good versus running backs. New England Patriots are good versus running backs. And both of those teams have top 10 defenses. So these guys are in a tough spot when it comes to the matchup. But they are coming off, both of them are coming off of bad weeks. And I think they could have a bounce back week here this week. So I'd play either one of these guys if you want to put a stud running back in your lineup. Wouldn't throw me off that they had bad weeks. Actually, it makes me want to play them even more. So Saquon Barkley is going to be about 36% owned. Dalvin Cook about 22% owned. So those are the stud running backs on the slate. Now, coming down in salary here, this guy exploded last week, and actually, he's been on fire the past 3 weeks. Take a look at Tony Pollard from the Dallas Cowboys playing the New York Giants, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Tony Pollard has averaged 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.8 rush attempts per game and 3.1 pass targets per game. But that volume has increased the past 2 weeks, and he's going to be about 27% owned, projected at 14.3 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. I'm going to bump that up to 18 fantasy points because he's getting quite a bit of volume and he's in a good matchup. So that's a new feature in Draft Dashboard. If you want to change the projected points for the player, you just tap on the projected points, put in your number, click OK, and then that projection will be used throughout the tools and the rankings. So Tony Pollard, he's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 1,900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Cowboys favored by 9.5. So I also like this pick because could be a running game script here. The Dallas Cowboys get out ahead of the Giants. Tony Pollard could get a lot of work in this one. And take a look at these last 3 games. Tony Pollard has scored 40, 25, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 15, 22, and 14 rush attempts on top of 6, 6, and 1 pass target. So I love to see that he's gotten 12 pass targets in the past 2 weeks. It looks like he's in a good spot here. The price tag is still low, so I like Tony Pollard here versus the New York Giants. Okay, now coming down from Tony Pollard, take a look at Ramondre Stevenson from the New England Patriots playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 13th most fantasy points, actually the 12th most fantasy points, or the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Ramondre Stevenson has averaged 16.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.4 rush attempts per game and 4.9 pass targets per game. So he's going to be about 35% owned, projected at 15.5 fantasy points here tonight. I'm going to bump that up to 17 fantasy points. And Ramondre Stevenson is 6,400 DraftKings salary. He's only 800 more on FanDuel. So I like that price on both sites. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, with the Patriots trailing by 2.5. Ramondre Stevenson has scored 14, 16, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 15, 15, and 16 rush attempts on top of 6, 7, and 8 pass targets. So I like to see the involvement in the passing game. That gives him some extra fantasy point upside. So I like Ramondre Stevenson here versus the Minnesota Vikings. So the other 2 running backs that I like, Jamal Williams from the Detroit Lions and Devin Singletary. Now, Jamal Williams scored 24 fantasy points last game off of 17 rush attempts. My only problem with this pick is that the Lions are projected to be behind by 9.5 or trailing by 9.5 in this game. So I'm not sure how many rush attempts Jamal Williams is going to get. If the Buffalo Bills take a 2-touchdown lead early, that could take Jamal Williams out of this game script. So I'd just be cautious there. But Vegas does think there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game. And he had a monster week last week. He's going to be about 24% owned, so I don't mind the play. But I think, and he's 5,900 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. But I think if I'm going to play one of the running backs from this game, I think it would be Devin Singletary from the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Devin Singletary, he's averaged 12.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11 rush attempts per game and 3.9 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 71% of the snaps, and he's going to be about 32% owned, projected at 13 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. I'm going to up that to 15 fantasy points. He's only 5,700 DraftKings salary, 1,200 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 54.5 points scored in this game, so I think this is a good game to stack. And Vegas thinks the Buffalo Bills are going to be, or they're favored by 9.5. So this could be a running game script for Devin Singletary, who has scored 18, 17, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 18, 13, and 8 rush attempts on top of 2, 2, and 5 pass targets. So he got 20 touches last week, and he could get 20 plus touches this week as well. Could absolutely turn into a running game script. And he's got a great matchup. Price tag is low. So I like Devin Singletary here versus the Detroit Lions.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So the stud on the slate, and he looks like he's in a great spot this week. I like Stephon Diggs from the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Stephon Diggs has averaged 24.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.4 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 77% of the snaps, going to be about 51% owned, projected at 25.5 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's 8,000 DraftKings salary, 1,300 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game, and Stephon Diggs looks like the best stud on the slate. Even with only 5 pass targets last week, he still scored 15 fantasy points. So he scored 15, 28, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 5, 16, and 10 pass targets. So I absolutely love this stud this week. I think he is underpriced. That's why his ownership is so high. Fantastic matchup in a high-scoring game. So I like Stephon Diggs here versus the Detroit Lions. Now I also like CeeDee Lamb, but he's got a harder matchup here versus the New York Giants, and he's 7,100 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. So I would prefer Stephon Diggs for only 900 more on DraftKings. I think CeeDee Lamb is a fine play, but I think I'd go with Stephon Diggs. So coming down in salary, you got Amon-Ra St. Brown from the Detroit Lions playing the Buffalo Bills, who have a good defense overall, but they do give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amon-Ra St. Brown has averaged 16.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.7 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 72% of the snaps, going to be about 42% owned, projected at 15.8 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's 6,600 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel, and this could be a passing game script as Vegas thinks that the Detroit Lions are going to be trailing by 9.5. So Amon-Ra St. Brown has scored 15, 25, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 8, 11, and 9 pass targets. So I think the price tag is right for this play in the matchup, considering it's going to be a high-scoring game, and it could be a passing game script. So I like Amon-Ra St. Brown here versus the Buffalo Bills. Now, if you want to save some salary at wide receiver, I got a couple of guys that I like here. Actually, 3 plays that I like. So they're all about 5,000 DraftKings salary. Similar price on FanDuel as well. So I like Gabe Davis, Jacoby Myers, and Darius Slayton. Now, Darius Slayton has scored 14, 19, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 10, 4, and 6 pass targets. He's only going to be about 15% owned, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's 5,000 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. This is another guy that could be in line for a bunch of pass targets if it turns into a passing game script. We know Vegas thinks the Giants are going to be trailing by 9.5 here. Now, he doesn't have as good as a matchup as those other 2 guys, so I still like Darius Slayton, but I also like Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall. They give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Gabe Davis has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.1 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 33% owned, on the field for 93% of the snaps. He's projected at 13.5 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's 5,300 DraftKings salary, 1,900 more on FanDuel. And Gabe Davis has scored 12, 21, and 5 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 7, 9, and 5 pass targets. So I like Gabe Davis here versus the Detroit Lions. Now, the other wide receiver with a great matchup is Jacoby Myers from the New England Patriots playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 6th worst defense overall. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, Jacoby Myers has averaged 14.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 28% owned, projected at 12.4 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's $5,100 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel, and Jacoby Myers has scored 9, 8, and 21 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 6, and 12 pass targets. So I like Jacoby Myers here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, moving on to the tight end position, I like TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings playing the New England Patriots, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.1 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 86% of the snaps, going to be about 23% owned, projected at 11.2 fantasy points here on Thanksgiving. He's $5,000 DraftKings salary, $1,300 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 2.5. So TJ Hawkinson has scored 8, 12, and 16 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 9, 10, and 9 pass targets. So I love the matchup, and I like the passing volume that he's got the last 3 weeks. 28 targets in the past 3 weeks. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the New England Patriots. Now, if you want to save some salary at the tight end position, take a look at Dawson Knox from the Buffalo Bills playing the Detroit Lions, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Dawson Knox has averaged 8.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.4 pass targets per game. He's been on the field for 81% of the snaps, going to be about 35% owned, projected at 9.2 fantasy points here tonight. Only $3,500 DraftKings salary, $2,000 more on FanDuel, and Dawson Knox has scored 14, 10, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 6, and 4 pass targets. So I think he makes a good value play. So I like Dawson Knox here versus the Detroit Lions.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.